Hey, today I thought we'd look at a question. Oh, here they go. Welcome, Petra.
Hello?
Oh, is that Hannah?
Yeah.
Excellent. Welcome. We got the how is Petra doing?
Better than yesterday, but still not great.
Okay. Well, we're keeping her in our prayers.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, today I thought we'd look at tonight, look at the question. What is it God, wants from us? What does He require of us? And in looking at this, there are lots of verses that sort of came to mind throughout the Bible, but I thought I'd just start off with, if you were asked that, if there was someone who, was asking you about Christianity, asking you about your faith, your religion, what is it that God wants from us? How would you answer that?
Well, I think part of it is I can't think where it was. Somewhere in John's Gospel. I'm just going from memory here, but the men who are around him, perhaps his disciples and others too, they're asking, what is our work? What's the work you want us to do? And he said, your work is to believe in the one whom the Father has sent. So I've always been quite struck by Jesus' reply. It's so simple as to be disarming, right? Because imagine they wanted to get a list of things they could go away and do, but to believe in the one whom God has sent. I think it could be partly an answer, Matthew. I don't know.
Galen.
I think to me, God's currently teaching me that it's about Christianity and faith is, I don't like the word religion. To me, the word religion has been politicized and I don't like it. But to me, it's about God restoring to us that which was lost. And that involves, some of the obvious stuff, about this world. But it's about the closeness that we had with him once upon a time. Of just a divine being and his creation. But it goes a lot further than that. It's not just a divine being in his creation. It's the closeness. It's considering that God sent his son. It's everything to him.
Bethel.
My first thought when you said it was the verse about what does God require of you. It's in Micah 6:8 where it says, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. which I thought was interesting, because at first, I thought of that verse, then I was like, well, I would probably tell someone that God actually wants a relationship. But that verse actually kind of covers it when it says walk humbly with thy God. So yeah, to me it's all about getting to know him and his son.
Hannah.
Mum's here listening as well.
Yeah, I don't know how long I'm going to be here for, but yeah, I think what God wants from us first and foremost is to let us be his friend, to let him be our friend, sorry, the other way around, and to let him look out for us. And like the verse you mentioned, Bethel comes after that. He just wants us to let him be our friend. It's really simple.
And something that just occurred to me a few days ago, God doesn't want us to be his pets. He wants us to be his children.
I've never heard it put that way, but that's a really good way. God doesn't want us to be his pets.
I haven't heard it put that way either. But I think sometimes I've found it. There was a quote that Ralph posted on the mission field months ago about when Jesus got back to heaven after his time on earth, the angels were praising him and wanting to spend time with him, and he was just wanting to get to his Father, to know that his sacrifice was accepted and that he just wanted us to be with him as soon as possible. And I guess I've subconsciously had in my head to some degree, he made us and we kind of went on the wrong track and he felt sorry for us, and well, here we are. He's kind of doing us a favor. But he's doing it, I mean, I guess we all kind of know that, but out of his love for us, because he loves us. It's not because he kind of just pitied these poor little creatures and thought he'd do us a favor, if that makes sense. And maybe it's along those lines that came to mind the other day. He doesn't want pets. That's not his purpose. That's not his goal. He wants us to be his children and his partners in this work to spread the good news in this world, that we can all go home soon.
Ralph.
It's been covered a fair bit with the getting to know him and that sort of thing, but I think too it's being able to learning that we can put our trust in him and that he won't let us down, that he works differently to us. And that's a learning experience, because there's not too many people on earth that we can put our trust in like we can do with God. It takes time to learn it.
Can we turn to Micah chapter 6? Bethel read out for us before verse 8. But can I just get someone to read Micah 6 from verse 1 up to verse 8? Because this whole thing is God, talking with Israel, all leading up to verse 8. So can someone read that out? And just want to look at what is the context, what is this conversation that he's having with them?
This is Micah 6, 1 to 8, is it?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, hear ye now what the Lord saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee out of the house of servants. And I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what Balak king of Moab consulted, and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God.
Hmm. So what is happening there? Now, verse 8 is that final call that he gives out, but what is happening in this sort of conversation leading up to that? What is God saying? Galen.
He seems to be reiterating a few things. And going through, what he's done before, mentioning Egypt, and what have you. And there also seems to be some almost rhetorical questions in verse 6 and 7. So it's almost like he's just, I don't know, it's almost like they're not getting it. And it's like he's having to, like a patient teacher going over it again, reiterating things, and sort of, as it says in verse 8, he's already done all this once, twice, hundreds of times, or whatever. He's already said, this is how it is. This is how I am. This is what I've done for you. Laid it all out and all the rest of it. But for some reason, we still don't get it. We're still not doing as he asks. But it almost seems like, I don't know, he's, it's almost like the cup is starting to get fuller. And it's like there's a bit of, I don't know, like, do I really have to do this again?
Hmm.
I'm not saying that that's what God's saying, but from that's how kind of we would do that. So maybe I'm looking at it from the wrong angle, but we know that when somebody's cup has been filled with iniquity, it's there's sentence is going to be passed, judgment is going to be passed, and going to be executed, is going to be done. So it's almost like the rim is fairly close. Yeah, sorry.
It starts off by saying that but the Lord has a controversy with his people.
Mm,
Right, but and so like it's God speaking here, but then as you mentioned, like in verse 3, God sort of with these questions indicating what's the issue he's got with his people. That's what the people are saying. Yeah, he says, "Oh my people, what have I done unto thee, and wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me." You know, it's like it's almost as if the people are blaming God, saying God's wearied us with all his requirements, with what he's asked, with all these things that's happening. And so God's challenging, you know, what have I done that's wrong? Where have I wearied thee? Testify against me. And again, in verse 6 and 7 with these questions, it's like God's saying, these are the things that people are saying. You know, wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? It's like his people are complaining that God's asking so much. You know, what have we got to give to God to make him happy with us? How much do we have to give to satisfy him? And it's like that's the cry of the people, and this is the issue that God's having with them. So he's calling, you know, where have I been a burden to you? Testify against me. And that's what he says in verse 3. And then verse 4 or 5, he presents to them what he's done. You know, was I a burden to you when I saved you from slavery? When I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to lead you out? When Balak, the king of Moab, wanted Balaam to curse you, and how I handled that? Was I a burden to you in all this? Now, this happened, you know, to reveal to you the righteousness of the Lord. And when they carry on talking about, you know, God requires so much, he sums it up with, no. The thing that God requires of you is to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And I find it interesting that those three things that he says he requires: to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. You know, do justly, you know, for your actions to be just, to be righteous, to be good. And then to love mercy. You know, loving mercy has a lot to do with how we see others' actions. So in regards to our own actions, we are to act justly. In regards to others' actions, we are to love mercy. And then finally, to walk humbly with thy God. And as Bethel pointed out before, that really highlights this relationship aspect of it. It's not to walk before your God. It's not to walk in the sight of your God. It's to walk with your God. Phil.
Yes, still on verse 8, it does say that God hath showed thee, O man, what is good and what doth the Lord require of thee. So I'm just inquiring as to, was that explicitly conveyed to them, or do they have to extrapolate? And I don't know the book of Micah well enough to know whether he's previously said it, or do they think back to the, you know, the law, perhaps Exodus and Deuteronomy. I'm just wondering, when it says he hath showed thee what is good and what the Lord requires of thee, Does anybody know if that's specified in Micah, or is it in, distilling earlier statements? I don't know.
I don't know if there's anything specific in Micah or specific where he's said that before, but you have the general tenet of, you know, what did God ask of Abraham? In Genesis 12, when he called him, he didn't ask Abraham, you know, you've got this big mountain of things you have to do. It was, you know, come, you know, leave your family, come in and come into a land that I will show you, and I will bless you, and I will curse him that curse him, and bless him that blesses you, and in you shall all nations of the earth be blessed. It was to have that walk and that journey with God. And that was seen repeatedly through his life and through God's dealings with Israel. And yeah, that's how I understand that anyway. It's not that there was this one previous time that God said this in another chapter. It's
No.
more that the entire tenet of God's dealing with Israel, he has been constantly showing that this is what he's asking.
Yeah, no, I see your points, and nonetheless, they don't seem to have got us, which I think we raised early on, where there's just a total, people they might say the miscommunication. Well, I don't really want to use that word too much, but they were just not getting it, were they? And they're still thinking in terms of sacrificing something of value to them, so that God would smile upon them, and you know, just so they're not seeing it in the same way that God is seeing it.
I was reading the book of Malachi earlier today, and one of the things that really stands out in there, you know, it's God's talking to them, and he says, you know, I've loved you. And then he quotes what the people are saying, but you say, wherein have you loved us?
Yep.
You know, and he says, you've polluted my altar. And then he says, but his people are good, but where have we polluted your altar? You know, and there's the constant thing going there. God's pointing out their sins, and they're saying, oh, when have we done this? We're innocent. When have we not done this? And when have you ever done anything for us? You know, his people had this, had everything backwards, and you know, that speaks to the deceitfulness of sin, I think, in a lot of ways. Petra or Hannah, whoever we have.
I really like what you brought out with Abraham. Walk in a relationship with me where you trust me, where you can't see, but I can. And yeah, from the Malachi verses there, it sounds like he's saying, look, I've given you a taste of who I can be to you. You know, so it's not like they're going on stuff they don't know. They've had a taste, but they're choosing not to see it or act on it.
Joel.
It reminds me of a situation where a family is walking, and I imagine that, you know, God's the Father, and we're as his children, and we're walking with our Father, and there is connection there, a bond there, but the father has a certain nature about him. He has knowledge, wisdom, understanding. He has depth to his personality and his character, and he wants us to experience that, and he wants us to grow in that type of character as well. And what it's stating here in Micah is it sort of resembles the children not really fully grasping the personality of the father, and the father's explaining plainly what he wants the children, what he wants us to do.
Hmm.
To grow.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that is interesting. Because in here, you know, God's having trouble with Israel, walking away and stuff. But I find interesting in this passage, like you mentioned, God's sort of pleading with Israel, trying to
Greetings, everyone.
guide them. Hey, Colin, how's it going? Yeah, God's trying to guide Israel, but it is a lot, you know, kind of a, like as you mentioned, that this family father teaching his children. You know, we know eventually when people rebel enough, as Gally mentioned before, that the cup of iniquity is filled and judgment comes. But there's actually no call for judgment in this setting. It's just, you know, sort of like the father pleading for the prodigal son to return home. Now, can we jump forward to what have we got here? Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7.
What chapter, sorry?
Matthew chapter 7.
Thank you.
And can somebody read verses 21 to 23?
I can if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils? And in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. I find that's the saddest 4 words in the whole Bible. I never knew you.
Yeah.
So again, this is another case where you've got, you know, just like in Micah, you had God and his people were sort of on completely different pages into what that relationship was supposed to be like, with their expectations and everything. And here again, we've got these believers and Jesus, and they're on completely different, you know, wavelengths on what this was supposed to be about. The people come up to Jesus, and what are they presenting as evidence that, you know, they've done the will of God? And then what does Jesus present as evidence that they haven't done the will of God? So what is the different mindset between the believers and Christ when it comes to doing the will of God here? Joel.
It looks as if it's the distinction that he makes is, but he who is doing the desire of my Father in heaven, like the will of the Father in heaven. Yeah, many shall say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? So in 21, he reveals that the desire of his Father in heaven, of our Father in heaven, through him, is actually the desire of the Father in heaven is known by Jesus the Son, but it's not known by the people that thought they were doing the desire of the Father in heaven. They got it wrong somewhere. They weren't connected. They weren't understanding something. Many works in your name. There's an interesting perspective surrounding that, is because the depths of understanding the name, in Hebrew, name is Shem, and in the ancient petrographic form, Shem is spelled, in Hebrew, Shem is spelled Shin Mem, and in the ancient petrographic form, Shin is the picture of teeth, and Mem is the picture of water. And so teeth, they chew, they bite. There's a lot of interesting things. They used to make fish hooks out of old teeth back in the day too, when they had old tooth, so it could be used to catch a fish. The water represents the depth. It represents flow. It represents cleansing. It represents life. And we know that name isn't just someone's name, but it's also someone's reputation. So understanding name as in reputation and action and that, and the teeth is the bite, the chew, the meditation, understanding of the waters, that's the depths of life that flow and cleanse.
Hmm.
So it's a name is actually someone's character. That's why Jesus blessed his disciples with a new name, or because it spoke of their character in a new way, a new revelation, a new insight into
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that is kind of interesting looking at the name here, because they start out and they reply as Lord, Lord. The double emphasis on that is that these people weren't sort of halfway believers. They're emphasizing that they were committed to Jesus as their Lord. Saying prophesied in their name and cast out devils in their name. They went out for the glory of Christ's character, his reputation, to do these things for him, to bring him glory. But still, Jesus says, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. And I think as Galen mentions, that what makes those words so sad is, these words weren't spoken to people who, had gone on, who had, persecuted Christians, who had lived their lives in drunkenness and debauchery, or who were generally evil people. These words were spoken to people who had committed their lives to serving Christ and to doing his work. But they had a fundamentally wrong understanding. And in doing that, they weren't actually carrying out the will of God.
it says here, yeah, the ones who work lawlessness,
Hmm.
who work, depart from me, you who work iniquity or lawlessness. So there's a connection there, even though they're crying out to him and saying what they've done in his name. There's something there that's just missing. It's
Hmm.
Because he says at the beginning in 21, but he who is doing the desire, the will of my Father in heaven. Revealing that, not everyone who says to me, Adonai, Adonai, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who is doing the desire of my Father who is in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Galen, what have you for us?
In the verses previous, we've got a lot of contrasts. We've got the narrow gate, the narrow and the wide gate. We've got a good tree with evil fruit, no bad tree with good fruit, or the fact that can't happen there. It's either one or the other. So I see this, and also after that you got the house on the rock and the house on the sand. So I see it as two contrasts. 21 and 22 to me are contrasts. Whereas you've got in 2021, sorry, the ones obviously that will enter into heaven will be the ones that do the will of his Father. Whereas in 22, we've got these people, as Joel rightly said, was it might have been you, Matthew, that said, these are not worldlings. These are Christian people. These are believers. Are they true believers? No, we don't know. But they're believers nonetheless. But they seem to be doing great works. Because, have we not, and in thy name done many wonderful works? It almost seems like, is it works versus faith? I don't know. But it just, to me, the contrast is great works versus the will of the Father. There will be some people whom God has planned to do great works. But there will be other people where God's will is the most simplest of things. And I think it's a contrast between those that do the will of the Father and those that are not doing the will of the Father, albeit they're doing all this apparently magnificent stuff, but it's not necessarily what God's plan is for them. So I think, to me, and that's why I think Christ has had to say, I never knew you, because there was no communication between the two. I mean, to know somebody, you've got to have a relationship, that closeness. You've got to know what the will of the Father is. And apparently these people in 23 don't know what the Father's will is, because they're not doing it, even though they're doing apparently these many wonderful things. So yeah, to me, it's about contrasts. And I think the fact that Christ has had to say, I never knew you, must rip his heart out, must break his heart to have to say that.
Petra.
Yeah, your comment before, Joel, about the name, when I found that out a few years ago, looking into the original meaning, it meant a huge amount, and it's really helped everything I've learned since to be in perspective. But to eat my flesh and drink my blood, we need to allow Christ to come to every cell of our being, so that he can power us from the inside out. And I think that those people, they may have had a great head knowledge, they may have been lifelong in whatever church they were in, they might have been elders in their church, but did they ever move from a head knowledge to a heart knowledge?
Another thing I was thinking about with ye that work iniquity being like lawlessness, if we see or understand God's law as a list of do's and don'ts, as a list of rules, it's very different to if you understand God's law as like a description of his character. So to be without his law would be to be against or like not in sync with his character.
The other thing, in keeping with your comments there, Galen, that dream where Jesus moved to the most holy place and his people followed him, but some didn't notice that he'd left and stayed behind, and they prayed and Satan breathed on them. You know, if there can be other supernatural things seen, and Satan will feed people that are not totally open to the truth, to try to keep them distracted. You know, blessed are you that hunger and thirst. That's not feeling like a nibble.
Phil.
Yes, I just had a few thoughts. The first thing is that it's shocking to see that many will say these things, right? Many suggests a lot of people, so that's quite a worry. And I agree, it's just a disaster for these people. And I don't fully claim to understand all this yet, but I just want to point out that the New Testament makes a distinction between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit. And if I'm not mistaken, 22 talks about, we come under the classification of the gifts of the Spirit, prophesying, casting out demons, devils, and doing many works. So my thinking is that, and tying again with what was said before about verse 20, wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. Now, the fruit of the Spirit there's 9 parts of it. It's like it's a singular noun, but there's 9 parts to it. But I am thinking that one thing they're missing out on, these people, is the fruit of the Spirit. One of which is faith. So and the other thing I was going to think about is that the fact that they repeated his name, you know, Lord, Lord, to me, I'm thinking it's possibly trying to emphasize and not so much get the Lord's attention, but saying, you know, repeating his name somehow have some sort of good impact on him. But I'm not sure about that. So anyway, the fruit of the Spirit is very different, and I think many churches need to study the difference between these two things because they're entirely different things. And what we need is the fruit of the Spirit. This is just my view, of course, but with the gifts of the Spirit are very different things entirely.
Ralph.
I think the first clue is that have not we done these works? You know, they're looking for, they got all these brownie points up. You know, we've done this and this and this. The people of God won't be saying that. They'll realize that it's Christ in them that's doing the works. And it's also shown quite clearly in Isaiah 58 as well. You know, they delight to seek after God. They like doing these things, but they're doing it in their own righteousness, which is filthy rags. So God won't recognize it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's one thing that stood out to me. You know, Jesus says, whoever does the will of my Father. And these people are presenting all their own works, you know, all the things that we have done as evidence that they've done the Father's will. But as the verse Phil shared at the very beginning, in John 6, when the people come up to Jesus and they ask the question, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? And Jesus' response is, this is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. You know, when Jesus says, you know, he that does the will of my Father, they said, well, look at all these works. Surely that must be the will of God. But Jesus says, no, you didn't do the will of God, because I never knew you. The will of God was for them to believe in Christ, to have that relationship with him, to trust in his righteousness. But they went about to establish their own righteousness by their own works. And when they get there, they present all their own works, all the things that they've done, as evidence that God should let them in, rather than presenting all the things that Christ has done. Rather than presenting, themselves as, Paul mentions in Ephesians 5 about the church being the bride of Christ, who Christ has sanctified and washed and cleansed. They are presenting themselves as the products of their own work, rather than presenting themselves as the products of what Christ has shaped them and formed them to be. Joel.
Yeah, man. It sort of bring that. Well, oh, sorry, I'll rephrase that. What that was really good what you said, man, and I totally agree. It makes a lot of sense. Sorry, I'm dyslexic. I get a bit mumble jumbled in my thinking sometimes. But what I was reading yesterday and today, last night and today, was John 15, and that describes that Jesus is the vine and his father is the husband, or the gardener, the one that takes care of the vine, and we are the branches. And if we are connected to him and we bear fruit, the Father will prune us. But if we don't bear any fruit, he'll cut us off from the vine, which is Jesus. And in verse 7 says that if you stay in me and my word stays in you, you shall ask whatever you want and it shall be done for you. And 8, in this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, that you shall be my disciples. And then 9, as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Stay in my love. Then 10, if you guard my commands, you shall stay in my love, even as I have guarded my Father's commands, stay in his love. 11, these I have spoken to you so that my joy might be in you and that your joy might be complete. But from 1 all through 15, it's talking a lot about the imagery, the allegory, the parable of the gardener, the vine, the branches, and the fruit, and the connection between those things and how they relate to each other. And an interesting thing about the fruit as well, and the Father as the gardener, is the gardener, the Father, he would eat the fruit, or and he would press the fruit, and he would drink the fruit. So yeah, it's really interesting. that parable.
Yeah. And I think that probably links back to what Phil was saying about the difference between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit. You know, and these people here are saying, look at all the gifts of the Spirit, look at all the works that we have done, rather than the fruits of the Spirit, you know, how God has transformed our lives. You know, the gifts are normally what people are drawn to. You know, people want to go see the big evangelist. People want to get wowed by some miracle of healing. But the fruits seem more what God is drawn to. That's more what He wants. That's that transformation. That's that life changing. That's showing that the working of the gospel to transform our hearts. Petra.
Yeah, I really appreciate what's been brought out with the difference between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit, because that just brings to mind the parable of the talents. God gives us gifts of the Spirit, but depends on what we do with them. You know, if we use them under His and surrender to Him and under His guidance and direction, then that results in growing the fruits of the Spirit. But if we don't, what we have will be taken away.
And I think linking onto this as well, the idea that it's about knowing Christ. That was the problem He found with them. You know, then I will profess to them, I never knew you. And that whenever I hear a verse that talks about, you know, knowing God or having that connection with Him, my mind always comes back to John 17, verse 3, where Jesus is praying to His Father. And He says, this is life eternal, that they might know Thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom Thou hast sent. So again, it highlights that the will of God there, the eternal life is about having that relationship, that connection, knowing the Father and Son. And these people, they had all those works, but they didn't have that relationship. That's what God requires of them. You know, back in Micah, when he was having this conversation with Israel, Israel was complaining about God being a burden and all these works that God's asking and all this stuff. And God says, no, it's, you know, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And that's the same thing Jesus says to the Pharisees. Does someone want to read out Matthew 23, verse 23? You know, Matthew chapter 23 is Jesus' sort of big chapter where, almost every paragraph starts to woe unto you, either Pharisees, scribes, he calls them all hypocrites, blind, ye fools. And then can someone read out verse 23?
So Matthew 23:23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone.
You're on mute, Matthew.
Sorry. Thank you, Galen. As I was saying to myself, I find it interesting that Jesus highlights that the three important things that they missed out was justice, mercy, and faith. And in Micah, when God says, you know, the things that God requires of you is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So that same justice, mercy, and faith. Now, can we turn back to Genesis chapter 2, the last verse we'll finish on tonight? Because it's a lot of what we've been looking at there, what God requires of us, what he wants from us. But there's actually something else here in Genesis 2 that I found interesting. It's not so much what God requires of us, but it's interesting. It still fits into what God wants. Can somebody read Genesis 2, verse 19?
I can read that. And out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof.
So when God was doing that, what did he want?
To name the animal.
Yeah, that's what he asked Adam, but it says there's a reason why he asked that. Why he asked Adam to do that. Galen.
To see what he would call them. It's like he wanted a dialogue. It's a two-way street. He wanted to know what Adam thought. He wants to know what we think about whatever happens to be going on that's pertinent to us at the time. You know, it's that I don't know where it is. Was it Jesus that said that he wants to call us friend? We're not to be called servants, but now friends. Well, is not. A master doesn't always want to know what a servant thinks, but a friend does. And friends should be, aside from the divine human side of things, but friends should be equal. That one is not above the other. Obviously, this is God we're talking about. So there is that, you know, there's that divine side of things. But if you kind of put that aside for the moment, friends are equals. There's give and take on both sides. There's he was interested in what Adam. There's an interest in what the other party, what your friend is doing. You know, whether it be in our time, in our scope, whether it be hobbies or interests or what's happening at work. What's happening at work or whatever. You know, it's both sides. It's not a solo effort.
Yeah, and that's what really stands out here. God had just created, you know, Adam, a free moral agent, having his freedom. And then this is another thing that, you know, we were discussing the sovereignty of God the other weekend. God wanted to see what Adam would call him. God wanted to see Adam express his own individuality his own personality, his own freedom of choice. And I find that interesting when it comes into our relationship with God. Not everything we do, I'll put it this way. God doesn't always want us to do everything according to his will. Okay? There are some things where God's looking and he wants to see us exercise our own will, which is exercise our own freedom of choice. Now, just to sort of clarify here, Adam was exercising his freedom of choice sort of within the direction, the guidelines, the mission that God had given him. You know, so it's not that God gave him a job and Adam went off and did something else. It was still within those boundaries that God had given him. But if Adam had turned around to God and says, God, you know, I want to make sure I name these animals the right names that you want me to call them, that would sort of defeat the purpose. God's like, no, I don't want you to name them what I want them to be. I want you to express your own freedom and name them what you want. You know, God has a direction he wants us to walk and serve in Christ, but he wants us to exercise our own individuality. We're not cookie cutter Christians. We're all individuals, and God created us like that. And that's part of what he enjoys about having that relationship with us. Petra.
Well, I've forgotten the first part of what I wanted to say, but anyway, yeah, I understand things a bit differently to you and Galen, if I've heard you right, but I'm okay with that. I believe God always has an ideal will for us and an ideal path for us, and that he can work with us when we deviate from that, for sure. But that he has an ideal path for us. And I believe that he, like with Adam, brain function.
Alright, give it a break. Give it some slack.
Yeah, that man was put on earth on probation, and for Adam to voice what he was going to call the animals was also God giving him an opportunity to act within God's will. Just like within God's will, there are often choices for me to make, but it's still within God's will. But that he always has an ideal will for us, and yeah, we have the choice to go outside of that, sure, and we can have really good intentions doing that, but with that comes consequences. And if we really want something, God will give it to us, because that's part of free choice. But if we want nothing more than his will, he will tell us that plainly each and every time, and that will be the most to his glory and the best for us and everybody around us.
I'm just thinking I need to get better at my lip reading. Sounds like something very interesting.
I was just saying, I've heard a similar thing. I'm not sure whether it leans more towards your view or Petra's view, but a friend was trying to explain to me once that, yeah, we don't need to ask God everything, because it's like a father taking a child to a park, and if the child's staying with the father and there's like a park around, I mean a
Fence.
fence around the park, you might have a swing and a slide and a roundabout and seesaw, and instead of the child going, well, what do you want me to play on, you know, God's like, well, as long as you stay inside the fence, you can play on whatever you like. He's there because, you know, you're there together, so you're in the right place, and he takes delight in you choosing what it is that you want to go and play on, basically, as long as you stay inside the fence of the park. And if you're going to leave, you only leave with him.
I like that imagery. Often we have the imagery of the law of God being a wall, that he put, a hedge about his people, but that defines sort of you'd say that the boundaries of righteousness. So anything beyond that wall is not safe, but anything inside that is safe. And there's so much freedom within the law. Like when the Jews were told to put that border of blue around their clothes, the blue represents the law. It's interesting that the sort of, if you got like the white linen, right, that's righteousness. The law is the little blue strip around the border at the edge. The whole thing wasn't law. The law didn't cover the whole thing. That the law was at the edge to protect that righteousness. Everything within inside that is righteousness.
Yeah, that sounds very nice and balanced. There's a couple of questions I have in that sort of thing of, having free will, but staying inside God's will. Sometimes it appears like people, might act like they have free will, assume that they're doing what's right. But then everything just turns into an utter mess. And then it's just almost like, if it's free will and the fact that everything turns into a mess, is it just because you weren't following God's will specifically that might have been needed in that moment? Or, I don't know. Sometimes it just seems like, you might hear stories of certain missionaries or something, and they totally believe God sent them in some direction. And then, they might lose half their family to something horrendous. It just doesn't sound good. And yeah, maybe I have a little bit much of a layer to see in mind, but it doesn't seem like it should be completely horrendous if it's all from God or you're in his will.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a very satisfactory answer, but we live in a sinful world. And I suppose the question is, it comes back to that: why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? CFL, God bless. It's sort of,
Thank you.
yeah, it's sort of that question. But I suppose the answer to that is, people get a say. There's still things that just happen in the world, and yeah, God could intervene and stop all that. Why doesn't he? Sometimes he chooses to, sometimes he chooses not to. And I don't necessarily think it's because people were outside his will. Look at the prophets in the Old Testament. What happened to them? Hebrews 11. People like to focus on the first part of Hebrews 11, where it talks about, all the amazing things that people did through faith. But then where is it? From halfway through verse 35. You know, it says all the awesome things that happened in faith beforehand, and then it says, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mockings and scourging, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. You know, all these having obtained a good report through faith. So, you know, a lot of those missionaries that, you know, turned up in Fiji and got eaten by the people, you know, got killed by some natives or diseased or shipwrecked or whatever. Again, here, these things all happen to prophets in the Bibles, and it says that, but they endured these things through faith. They have obtained a good report. I'm not sure why God allows that or would call someone to be a missionary who's going to go somewhere and just die. But as he said to Job, you know, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth, when I set the stars in their places? The fact that we don't know these things is why we follow him. If we did know them, we wouldn't need to follow anyone else. We would know the way. We could just walk it ourselves. So that's a very long way of saying I don't know to your question, but that's the best I can do right now. Petra.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't mean that you weren't listening to God's will, Bethel. If you're asking God for his will and you are clear that you're in his will and stuff goes to mess, then you have extra confirmation that God has allowed you to walk here for a reason, and that he's allowed what's happened to happen for a reason, and that he has a way through for you. And that does make it easier. The other thing is, walking through heavy trials like that builds your relationship with God like nothing else. And that increased relationship may be what makes a difference to somebody else's decision for God or not in the future. You know, there are people who have gone out into the mission field and their whole family's been killed, and there's just a wife left or a husband or something, or a child or whatever. How that person deals with it is a huge testimony. So, and sometimes it needs something drastic like that to get through to people. So, hey, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. This is not heaven. It took me a long time to realize that good results were not guaranteed down here. But if it's allowed, hey, sometimes our choices, our deviating from God can cause a problem. But there are also times, I believe, where we are walking in God's guidance and he's saying, okay, child, you and I can do this together.